right, welcome back to continue the discussion in Genesis 21. Now, here are the reflection questions that we were going to discuss. Number one, what does Genesis 21 teach us about the trustworthiness of God's promises? And how do we respond when his timing doesn't match our expectations? All right, let's sit with this for a moment. Genesis 21 is one of those chapters where the promise finally shows up in full color. After decades of waiting, Isaac is born. Abraham is 100 years old. Sarah's past the age of childbearing. From a human standpoint, from a human point of view, this wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. But God did what he said he would do. And that's the big takeaway here. God keeps his promises even when his timeline stretches way past ours. Let's be real. If most of us had to wait 25 years for something God promised us, we would have given up long ago. Or worse, we tried to force the outcome ourselves, like Abraham and Sarah did with Hagar back in chapter 16. But God doesn't need our shortcuts to fulfill his plans. When Paul reflects on this story in Romans 4, he says Abraham did not waver through unbelief, through being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. Now, if we read Genesis carefully, we know Abraham did waver at times, but Paul highlights the core truth: his faith endured. Not perfectly, but persistently. So what does this mean for us? It means that faith doesn't always look like certainty. Sometimes it looks like waiting, wrestling, and walking through dry seasons where nothing seems to be happening. But even in those seasons, God is still at work. And when the promise finally comes, like Isaac, it brings a kind of laughter that only God can produce. A laughter that says, only he could have done this. So here's a question that I'd invite you to reflect on. Are there any areas in your life where you've stopped expecting God to show up because it's taken too long? Genesis 21 reminds us, delay is not denial. And when God moves, it's never late. It's always right on time. Reflection question number 2. What do Hagar and Ishmael's story in this chapter teach us about God's mercy even outside the covenant promises? Now let's talk about Hagar and Ishmael, because honestly, this is one of the most emotionally complex parts of Genesis 21. Abraham sends them away, not because he wants to, but because God tells him to listen to Sarah. It's a painful scene. Abraham is torn up about it. Hagar is devastated, and Ishmael is a boy crying in the wilderness. At first glance, this feels harsh. Why would God allow this? But let's take a closer look. Even though Ishmael isn't the child of promise, even though he's not part of the covenantal line through Isaac, God still hears him. That's powerful. Remember, Ishmael's name means God hears. Yishmael in Hebrew, and in verse 17 it says, God heard the boy cry. His name gets fulfilled right there in the desert. And then just when Hagar thinks it's all over, God opens her eyes to see a well. The well was already there, but now she can see it. That right there is a sermon in itself. Sometimes the provision is already around us. We just need the spiritual clarity to recognize it. God didn't drop a new well from heaven. He opened her eyes to see what was already part of his plan. What I love about this part is that it shows us something about God's character. He is faithful, not just to the covenantal line, but also to those on the margins. In fact, if we trace Ishmael's line, we'll find that he becomes the father of many nations, just as God promised. He's not erased from the story. He's not forgotten, and that challenges us to think more broadly about who God sees and who we might overlook. It also reminds us that God's mercy isn't limited by our theology. We tend to draw circles around who we think is in and who's out, but God's compassion often spills over those lines. So maybe the deeper invitation here is to ask, who are the Hagars or the Ishmaels in our world today? Who are the people outside the spotlight outside the promise who still need to know what God hears, who still need to know that God hears them. And maybe even more personally, have I ever felt like Hagar, cast out, overlooked, or wandering in a desert season? If so, Genesis 21 is a beautiful reminder that you are not forgotten. God hears, God sees, and he's already prepared the well. You might not see it yet, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Closing thought for Genesis 21 is a chapter of contrast. It holds joy and sorrow, laughter and weeping, covenant and wilderness. But through it all, God is faithful. Faithful to fulfill his promises to Abraham, faithful to provide for the outcast, faithful to establish peace where there was once conflict, faithful in the long arc of redemption that stretches from Isaac to Jesus, to us. So as you reflect this week, hold on to this tension. God is both the God who fulfills and the God who sustains, God who brings laughter and the God who meets us in the tears. And whoever you are on that journey, you are held in his hands. Well, thank you for joining me for continuing the discussion for chapter 21. We'll be back tomorrow for chapter 22.